that now. So there we go. Okay, well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining. And we've just got an hour, so this is going to be a really good exercise in being concise for me. So emotional intelligence for tough times. And I presume everyone is joining today really because they've been struggling in some way with navigating all of the madness that's been happening in the last year. But, it's not just about the pandemic, of course. It's about all of the other things happening around us all the time, right? It's maybe economic worries, political instability, climate change, to name but a few of the big things going on at the moment. So, before we start really talking about emotional intelligence, I would invite everyone to just close their eyes for a moment. And I just want you to think of a place that you know, or it can be an imaginary place that makes you feel really good, really safe. Just go back to that place in your mind for a moment and just notice what it looks like, what the sounds are that you can hear, maybe how it feels. You can imagine maybe the grass or the sand or whatever it is under your fingertips. What smells there are. And just take 3 deep breaths for a moment in that place. And while you're doing that, just smile. It might feel really silly, but just put on the biggest, silliest smile you can on your face. All right. And now slowly come back into the room and open your eyes again. All right. So that was just a very short example of, emotional intelligence in action, getting ourselves into a bit more of an open and relaxed mood for what's coming up. Okay, so I'd love if you could type in the chat just briefly where you are and maybe, a couple of things about yourself. So sort of where you're joining us from today and maybe a sentence about what brings you here. And that'll be great. We can see the chat going by as we talk so we can get a better idea of who's here with us today. If we had a small group, I'd get you to all introduce yourselves, but we'd end up probably with a third of the workshop going to that at the moment. But I will ask some of you to share a little bit more later. Okay. So this is basically what I'm hoping to cover in the next hour, which is what is emotional intelligence, and understanding fear, sadness, and anger a little bit, getting an idea of how our body responds to threat. So I'm sure you've all heard of the fight or flight or freeze response, but just delving into that a little bit. How to recognize our triggers and our thought patterns, a little bit about why uncertainty is so hard to manage, and generating useful emotions in the body. So getting an idea of what we can do to feel better, really. Okay, so let me just have a look at the little chat going by because I really love to see who is here. Stratford-on-Avon, I used to live there. And Michelle, I used to work with back in Manchester, way back in the day. We've got people in Albania, India, Montenegro, Ireland, wow, Sweden, look at that. We've got a wide range. Ah, wow, South Africa. Okay, okay, so Sarah is like me working with eco-anxiety and eco-conscious people. That's great. Kathleen is here. Hello. All right, wonderful. So emotional intelligence. Okay, so if you're not aware of what it is, in a small nutshell, it's being smart about our feelings and understanding that emotions are data, right? So in the world, quite often we're taught to ignore emotions or maybe just see them as these irrational, childlike things that get in the way of business or get in the way of productivity, right? And you might have heard a lot of sayings like leave your emotions at the door, or this idea of, if you're in the UK, there's very much this idea of the stiff upper lip, sort of ignoring emotions as much as possible. And it's not always seen as very professional, civilized to bring emotions into the conversation. Uh, However, in a way, the opposite is true. So people who pay attention to their employees' emotions are much more likely to keep those people around. And people who, practice and work on their own emotional intelligence usually have a lot of better outcomes in life. And there are some really nice books and papers around this if you're interested in seeing the business case for emotional intelligence, which is a paper by 6 Seconds, the Emotional Intelligence Network. And of course, the classic book is Emotional Intelligence by Daniel Goleman. That's sort of the Bible of emotional intelligence, possibly, or at least the first book that brought awareness to the topic. So I'm trained by 6 Seconds, as I said, the Emotional Intelligence Network. There are, of course, other trainings and other companies doing this, but I really love what they do because they are a non-profit and they do a lot of really great work as well with teaching EQ to children in developing countries, for example. So you can see here what they say about EQ. And yeah, generally the thought is being able to understand, use and manage your own emotions. So quite often people think that emotional intelligence is just about being aware of your own feelings, or I've heard people say being able to control your feelings. It's a lot of things. Yeah, it's also empathy for how other people are feeling, so understanding, emotions in general, having a kind of emotional literacy, and yeah, controlling your emotions in terms of navigating them, right? So it's not about pushing down the bad feelings and hoping they go away. It's much more about recognizing what you're feeling, why you're feeling it, and then maybe looking at what you can do about it. Yes, so I've said there are lots of good outcomes, good reasons to work on your EQ. So this is my very short goal for today, recognizing our emotions, understanding where they come from, and finding ways to change or counter our stress response. And yeah, this is the sort of model that 6 Seconds has for emotional intelligence. So it's looking at the what, the how, and the why. And I like this because it brings in a bigger picture as well. So it's not just how am I feeling and what are my options, but it's, how does this match with my vision for my life or my greater sense of purpose as well? Sort of why am I doing this? Yeah, so even when we come here today and we think, I want to manage my emotions better, or I want to feel better in this pandemic, we can even ask why, what's the real why behind that? Is it just because you want to feel better, or is it because you want to be a better friend or partner? Is it because you want to contribute more to the world, and come from a place of really being more grounded? So I'm going to stop sharing for 1 second now. So, those of you who know me will know that I'm kind of mean and I throw people into breakout rooms. So I'm going to do that for a moment. So we're going to have a very brief conversation with each other. So I'm going to put you into pairs, just 5 minutes. And what I want you to discuss is just what are the main emotions that you've been feeling recently? So that can be over the last year of the pandemic, really. What are the emotions you've been feeling recently. And I'll put you for, we'll say 5 minutes. So, yes. So just make sure that you're keeping an eye on the time and making sure everyone gets to share equally. Yeah, because I've put automatic breakout rooms, so it's put some people into threes and some people into twos. Okay, so I'll say 6 minutes, that's fair. Okay, so here we go. How have you been feeling, or what are the main emotions you've been feeling in the last few months? Okay. Welcome back in.
I am back here.
Yeah, right. I think everyone's back. Great. So, is there anyone? I'd maybe just ask one or two people to share really briefly. Was there a common theme in your room?
I'm just going to say displacement.
Displacement.
We were, all living in places that were different from where we normally, where we grew up, perhaps, or, I'm Canadian and I live in the UK. I was with Kathleen, who's in the Czech Republic, but American, and somebody else who is Indian, but has lived most of her life in the States.
Oh, wow. Yeah. So a lot of displacement. That's a common theme. I seem to always meet people who are not living in their home countries. Wow. All right. And anybody else want to jump in and share?
Yeah, in our group, there were feelings of insecurity, confusion, anxiety, but also throughout the year, despite all the things that happened, feelings of joy and feelings of happiness.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is just ask you for a moment to just think of one of those emotions that you've talked about. So one of those prevalent emotions that's been quite strong this year. And just, close your eyes again for a moment. And let's just, sense that emotion. So if you think about whether it's anxiety, joy, fear, could be calmness, anything. Just notice how that emotion feels in your body. Yes, so how do you know when you're feeling that emotion? Maybe it's, you feel it in a certain place in your body. Maybe you feel your heart rate changing. Maybe something in your posture changes. So just being aware of how that emotion feels. And then we can take another step further and ask, what is that emotion telling you? So if you were to imagine that emotion as a character for a moment, just think about what would they look like? And if you just take a moment and just imagine yourself asking that emotion, what is it that you want to share with me? Just see if it says anything. And if anyone would like to share what their emotion said, please feel free to let me know. So the reason I got you to do that is part of emotional intelligence is it's really somatic awareness, right? It's really about being aware of our bodies, because what are emotions but things we feel in our body, chemicals, hormones, changes in heart rate. There may be much deeper than that, and it's quite reductionist to say that, but if we're not connected to our bodies, if we're not aware of what's going on in our bodies, then it can be very hard for us to have that first step of emotional intelligence, which is that awareness of how we're feeling.
Gwyneth, I was actually going to
ask you whether you were referring to a somatic experience or an emotional one.
Ah, yes. Well, I guess that's the question of, where do we really draw the line, right? Because for some people, they'll say that emotions are completely in the mind or in some external place like the soul or psyche, and others who take a more, I guess, hardline scientific approach will say it's a somatic experience. So right now I'm sort of, asking you, what's the somatic experience of that emotion?
Yeah. So that's somatic intelligence.
Yeah, definitely.
That's linked to the nervous system.
Yes, exactly. So that's where we're going to go now. So I'm going to reshare my slides if you are ready for a bit more of this. Okay, so, the very basic thing that I was talking about was an example of fear, right? And I've got this very silly example of someone seeing a mouse and getting afraid. And the question here would be, how do you know when you feel a certain emotion? So we'll say fear as an example. How does that feel in the body? And then, in terms of asking that emotion what it has to say to you, another thing we're sort of asking there is, why do we have that emotion in the first place? Yeah, so why did that emotion evolve? So, if anyone would like to throw in their thoughts on fear as an example, right? Like, why did fear evolve anyway as an emotion? Yeah, and I'll let you type thoughts in the chat. That would be great as we go on now. So I'm not going to go into a deep science lesson, obviously, because we're just here for an hour. But Daniel Goleman in his book Emotional Intelligence has a lot of really nice explanations for why a lot of the main emotions we have might have evolved. And I want to say before going into that, the standard theory says that we have these 6 basic emotions, but that's based on studies where they ask people from all over the world how people in different pictures are feeling. And there is a body of research growing that says, well, it's not really as if we have these concrete emotions in our brain, sort of here's anger, here's fear. It's, everyone might experience those differently. And it's really that as we grow up and we feel a mix of different things in our bodies, and somebody tells us, oh, you're angry, we start to learn, oh, okay, this must be anger. So there's a chance that when I feel angry and when you feel angry, we might be having slightly different responses in our bodies. Yeah, so keeping that in mind, there's a woman called Lisa Feldman Barrett who writes a lot about this different theory of emotions. But for the sake of simplicity, we've got little examples here, and I've just taken these quotes from Daniel Goleman just to give you an example. What happens with anger, and this is what he says. The heart rate increases, rush of adrenaline, basically our body getting us ready to fight, right? And that would be the purpose of anger way back, would be to get us ready to fight. And fear, as you said here, yes, so protection, to keep us safe, escapism, yeah, absolutely. So again, he says, when we feel the blood rush from our face and we go sort of blood runs cold kind of thing, that's because the blood is going down to our legs, so giving us maximum energy to run away. But there's also that moment of freezing, right? And that might be to figure out a reaction. Unfortunately, it's not always the most useful response, because it can mean that the blood is also going to your extremities and isn't circulating in your brain, which is why it can be very hard to think clearly or to form, a coherent sentence if you're really anxious or nervous. And again, if we think about our ancestors way back, of course, it would have made sense to have this reaction if there was an immediate danger. So a few more, and if anyone's seen that film Inside Out, you'll know where these characters are coming from. So disgust, right? That's a response to something that's potentially poisonous. So our face literally scrunches up to try and minimize, the fumes coming in or whatever that is, and that feeling sick around something that we've learned might be dangerous for us. Yeah. So sadness is an interesting one because what I've read about a lot this year in the pandemic is the grief, right? And there's real grief from losing people, and there's grief from losing a way of life or losing a future that we thought we had. And sadness itself is maybe an emotion people don't understand as much in that evolutionary way, but I think it's really interesting how he says here that this loss of energy that we get from a loss may have kept saddened and vulnerable early humans close to home where they were safer. So yeah, I'll give you a moment to just read that slide. Yes. And then on the more pleasant end of things, of course, we've got emotions like love and joy. And we'll talk briefly about that in a moment, the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. But love and joy are sort of the antidote, right, to those feelings of anxiety and anger. So while the fight or flight is telling our body to, get into action, run away or fight or do something, speeding up our heart rate, sending adrenaline through our body, this feeling of love and safety and joy is kicking in the parasympathetic nervous system. So that's sort of the brakes, right? It's the other side of it. So that slows down your heart rate, that makes you feel safer. And, again, we can think from an evolutionary perspective, this would be the signal telling you everything's good, stay here. This is where there's family and friends and, good food. It's almost rewarding you for staying there with those nice, good feelings. So, so those are just a little bit from Daniel Goleman. And often people say, one of the problems these days is that we evolved thousands, millions of years ago. It depends if we're looking at just Homo sapiens or, our ancestors before that, but we evolved in a very different world from the one we're in now, right? So there's this idea of the mismatch, how we have this Stone Age brain in a modern body. And so back when you were faced with a lion on the savannah running at you, it made sense to have that, that fear response where you'd feel all that anxiety and you'd run away, because the people who didn't have that, who were stopping to smell the flowers, they probably got eaten by the lions. But when you're in the office and you're being told by your boss, come on, you need to work harder, there's a deadline, that same response doesn't really make sense as much, right? And there's another part to that too, which is, if you have everything in your body screaming at you to run away or to attack, to do something to protect you as an organism, and you can't because you're telling yourself, no, that's socially inappropriate, I need to stay here, then there's also an argument that, those hormones are stuck inside your body and leading to chronic stress problems later on, leading to more problems. So that's one reason that if you start reading things about the stress cycle, you'll see that exercising or doing something to tell your body that it's in a safe situation, again, can be really effective. So that can be, punching a punching bag or running or doing something that tells your body that it's out of the danger again. So yeah, so this is just something to think about, is that, we've evolved a long, long time ago. And so the dangers we face normally are not always, proportionate to the response. However, here we are in a pandemic, right? Suddenly we are being faced with very real threats to our lives. And especially the way that you read about it in the media, it's almost that constant messaging that, you know, your life is in danger, you're going to get sick. And, you know, of course, disease and illness is a very ancient fear, right? Whether that's in our DNA or passed down from generations, that sort of, you know, intergenerational trauma of all the plagues we've already survived through as a species. That does trigger a lot of emotions. So that fight or flight response, as we just talked about, that's, you know, when something triggers that automatic nervous system into telling you you need to run, you need to fight, or you freeze in place. And yes, so that's what I've said. Yeah, and so generally, the body's pretty good at handling short-term stress, right? So you might have experienced, if you were driving and something suddenly came out into the road, you'll feel that very, very alert feeling of adrenaline flooding your body as you swerve out of the way. And it might take you a few minutes to calm down again. But generally, most of us are okay the next day or in a few hours, yeah. But it's this long-term constant background stress that is really damaging, right? Because the pandemic isn't a thing we can just see and run away from. It's this invisible thing in the air, right? It's almost like this idea of well, demons or something, right? Like floating around us. You never know when it's coming, and that causes more of that chronic long-term stress. So being aware of just how stress works in the body, I think, is really important for understanding our own reactions during this time. Yes. So the fight or flight response, you know, we tend to think of it as a very typical, oh, we fight or we run away or we freeze. But of course, it's much more complicated than that in real life and in a long-term situation as well. So you might recognize some of these reactions in yourself that you hadn't realized were fight or flight. But, you know, attacking people on social media, posting these very angry, outraged posts or blogs online, like, oh, I can't believe these people are doing this during a pandemic. You know, this outrage, pushing information on other people. So sometimes if we learn something new and we just feel like we need to send that article to everyone, we need to force them to read it. And it can also show up as berating our peers for their bad behavior, right? So that can be, again, having a proper go at someone because they didn't follow lockdown measures or something. And when we're in that fight or flight mode, we do tend to have a lot more of this black and white thinking. You know, so everything is either good or bad. You're with us or you're against us. And, you know, understanding this can also help us see how, you know, extremism is able to recruit people who are already traumatized and already in that survival mode. And of course, it can show up as actual violence or aggression. So if you see some of the protests going on at the moment from people who, you know, don't believe the pandemic is real, that might escalate into violence or aggression. These are all these kind of fight mechanisms taking place, right? Could also look like avoidance and denial, and it's more of a mental flight than a physical one. So it's predicting our own future to be much rosier than other people's. So if you've started planning for the return to back to normal, you're booking your flights already, you're telling yourself that you won't get COVID because, you know, bad things don't happen to me. All of these things can be a kind of denial. Breaking lockdown rules and rationalizing it, you know, sort of telling yourself, oh, well, it's okay when I do it because ABC, but when other people do it, it's bad. So if anyone's recognizing any of these things in themselves, yeah, just let us know in the chat. And freezing as well, right? So that can be sort of dissociating and numbing. So distracting ourselves a lot from what's going on by maybe watching a lot of TV, or, you know, there's a lot of increased alcohol use during the pandemic, for example, and getting stuck as well on, oh, well, what can I do? So almost going into this apathy that there's nothing I can do about it. Yeah. So the question is, understanding all of that, what can we do? So, that first step to emotional intelligence is knowing what's going on. Yeah. So knowing yourself, recognizing what's happening by checking in and seeing how you feel at the moment, and also recognizing what is it that's caused this. Yeah. What was the trigger that caused this emotion to take place in me? So just a couple of other things really to remind you is the 6-second rule. So if you feel that, you're being, they call this hijacked. So it's when, you are taken over by an emotion so strongly that you don't even know what's going on. So you might have had that if you, suddenly were confronted by someone and the whole incident's a bit of a blur, and then you later find out that you shouted at them or something. So if you feel something like that's happening, and you have that possibility to step back, focus on something nice. So it's almost that classic old advice of, you feel yourself getting angry, you take a deep breath and you count to 10. It could be something that works for you. So it could be going into that place in your mind that feels safe and comfortable, stepping outside for a walk, looking at nice videos of puppies online, right? If you feel yourself spiraling into that anxiety. And also it's looking at what factors are adding to stress in your life. So, it's not to say that the pandemic isn't stressful, because of course it's really stressful and it's really, hard at the moment, because none of us know, right, how it's going to go. None of us really can say with any certainty that it's all going to be okay. So, we have to have this balance between gaslighting people and telling them, oh, well, your reaction's all in your mind. And on the other hand, looking at, well, what can you control? So, you can't control the outcome of the pandemic, maybe, but maybe you can control how much of an emotional effect it's having on you, right? And so an example is, if you're scrolling through news stories for an hour and it's just making you feel more and more anxious, it's asking yourself, do I actually need to do that? What's the real reason behind doing that? Is there a way I can maybe stay informed, but without triggering myself to go into this spiral? Yeah. And then there's little things, going back to the somatic, right? So for me, I've been cutting down on coffee because I realized coffee makes my heart rate increase. And when my heart rate has increased, I perceive that as anxiety. And so actually, these chemical things can have an impact as well. And that's step one, so looking at what can you change or eliminate, and then we'll go in a minute to how can we really bring out the more useful emotions that we want. So as I've said, understanding the stress cycle, so that your body needs to know that you're safe. So again, exercise and things like that. So I really recommend Emily Nagoski's book on the stress cycle. I'll just type in her name there. She explains it very well, and also how that relates to sex as well. Okay, and so this is the thing again, right? We've looked at the stimulus and response. So if you see something that is clearly a danger, I put a mouse because I don't want to actually trigger people if they have a fear of snakes or spiders or something. But the thought is, when we see something like this, an innocent, harmless graph, what is it that triggers that anxiety response within us? Well, it's obviously what the graph means, right? So it's how we interpret it. So in other words, the thoughts that we have. And so this is just an example of someone with a very active thought process, that they reach, the figures are increasing, and so they start to think, oh, we're all going to die, the economy is going to go to hell, It basically ends with a Mad Max scenario in which I have to fight with my bare hands to stay alive. And so where can we step in between you know, what's actually there in the real physical world and our reaction, because everything between that is a thought, right? It's a story that we're telling ourselves. And of course, it can be a story we're collectively telling ourselves. So it's, again, it's not to say that this graph isn't scary, because it is, because we all know what that means. But, you know, it's the question of, can you step in to that space and look at what your thought process is and go, hang on a minute, you know, is this really rational? Is this really likely? Yeah. So recognizing our triggers, this is a really important part of emotional intelligence, right? So with that pen and paper, I'd invite you to just spend, we'll just do 2-3 minutes of as many of these statements as you can think of. So when A, I, B. So that can be either, you know, when I do something, it causes this emotion. So when I read news stories, I feel anxious and constricted. Or it can be how I act when I do have an emotion. So when I feel anxious, I snap at people, for example. Okay, so let's just take a couple of minutes to write some of those down. And if you want to write some of them in the chat as well, that would be very welcomed. I'll stop that share for a second. Okay, so someone's put, when I'm in physical pain, I snap at people. When I feel stressed, I sleep. Yeah. And I see this great conversation also happening about spending time in nature. And I'd say, yes, definitely. That's my other real passion, is eco-psychology and connecting to nature. So there's a whole other workshop and conversation there about, yeah, at the most basic level, right, how being in nature can really help us regulate our emotions. Give you another minute to list as many of those as you can. Okay, some very interesting ones. So when I don't spend a day as planned, I feel the need to punish myself tomorrow. When I watch news stories, I feel angry and helpless. When my baby starts crying, that makes me feel overwhelmed. When I pause for a moment to gather my thoughts. When I'm tired, I snap at my children. Okay. So just this awareness as a first step, right? It doesn't mean we instantly have a solution for it, but just being aware of what our triggers are and how we behave when we're in a certain state of mind. So when I'm just thinking of looking at one of those as an example. So when I watch news stories, I feel angry and helpless. Yeah. So Claire, can I get you to share a tiny bit more about that? Sort of what's the process for you?
Well, yeah, I've given up watching.
Oh, sorry.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, it's a bit quiet.
Yeah, I'm having problems with it seems to be okay when I'm in a small group, but really quiet. I don't know what's going on with it. What happens? Yeah, I get quite angry with. Well, I quite often get angry with the way things are reported, and I also feel quite helpless sometimes. Depends what it is. Yeah.
Yeah. So what would you say are some of the wider thoughts that come out of that? So between watching the story and that feeling, what's the story of, what causes that helplessness, do you think?
Just feeling like I can't impact. I don't have any sort of agency, I suppose.
So it's almost every time a story confirms that belief, right? That it's too big, it's too much. It triggers that feeling again of helplessness. Yeah. Okay. So let's look at what we can do, because we're just in the last bit, and obviously, I would be happy to sort of go into that for an hour of coaching, but we won't do that now. But yeah, it's not necessarily the actual thing we're seeing, right? It's the perception we have. So one person might see the news and go, oh, I need to write to my MP, or I need to get involved. And another person might see that same exact thing and think, oh, well, this just proves to me how helpless I am, how little we can affect change. And what causes that reaction is going to, of course, depend on millions of factors from your life up until that point, right? Like what you've been taught in the world about how much control you do have, how much power you do have. And that's actually linking nicely to what I wanted to say about uncertainty, right? Which is that the brain hates uncertainty. And according to some studies, we actually would prefer to know for sure that things are going to be terrible than to have that uncertainty, to have that, oh, maybe they'll be okay and maybe they won't. So if we knew for absolute sure that, everything was going to be completely destroyed, our brains would actually be happier with that, because we're like, well, now at least I know, right? At least now I can plan accordingly. But it's that uncertainty that really causes a lot of distress for us. And so that's another thing to think about, is how do we minimize uncertainty and how do we accept uncertainty? So many of you might be familiar with that serenity prayer, right? Which says, God grant me the courage to change the things I can, to accept the things I can't, and the wisdom to know the difference. So it's really looking at what can we actually change and what can't we actually change, right? And that need for control that we have, that really might show up in a lot of strange ways. So if you think about what behaviors can we explain by humans' need to feel certain and feel in control? Well, you get everything from superstitions, perfectionism, obsessively reading every news story to stay informed, posting on social media all the time because we're convinced we can change people's behavior. It can manifest in anxiety and OCD, but also it can manifest in depression and helplessness, right? If we get to that point where we feel like, oh, I can't affect change, we might just become very numb and apathetic. And so I'd invite you for a moment just to think about, what has your life taught you about what is within your control? And, are we preparing or are we just panicking? So I'll just screen share with you for a moment and I'll send you this because I think it's a nice one to do when you've got more time. But just to really list the things you're worried about, because we often walk around with this anxiety of what if this goes wrong, but we don't answer that question. We just sort of say, what if, and then we feel that anxiety. And so you can screenshot this if you want, or I'll email it afterwards. But it's just where you list all the things you're worried about right now, and what you're worried might happen in the future. So for one thing, that helps you separate, you know, what is actually a pressing issue right now and what's a sort of abstract maybe thing that, you know, you don't know if it'll happen. And then you go through that list and you rate those things in terms of, you know, how likely is that actually, do you think? So from 1 to 10. And then how bad would that be? And so then you're able to start with the most likely and the worst things. And then you look at possible solutions you can take. Yeah, so you really start to look at what your options are. And that's one of the competencies, again, for emotional intelligence, according to 6 Seconds, is exercising optimism. And optimism is not really meant as, you know, pretending everything will be fine, but more of looking at all the options you have and being able to access the resources you have. So, you know, those options might be asking other people you know for advice. It doesn't mean you have all the answers within you. So this is something I'd really recommend trying later on. And so, yeah, just to remember again that our emotions are not always rational. They're a survival response from the oldest part of our brain, and they're designed to keep you safe. So, you know, there's an element of let's feel appreciation and gratitude to them. And sometimes they do contain a lot of important information or wisdom, right? So sometimes your emotions are telling you, I need to quit this job, or, you know, I'm not happy in the situation. But other times they might not be. They might be acting in a way that's not so constructive. And that's when we bring in the EQ, really. Yes, I don't need to go into that right now. I just want to go into the final bit of, you know, navigating emotions. So controlling our emotions in a way, only, like I said, you know, it's not about suppressing things that are really helpful, because of course those unpleasant emotions can be very important. But when they're, you know, when they're not helpful, it's looking at how do we generate the emotions that we do want. And so if you think back to the beginning when you talked about what were, you know, the most common emotions you've been feeling at the moment, just look at that again and then ask yourself, what emotion would I like to feel more of? So again, maybe you can type that in the chat. What emotion would you like to feel more of at the moment? What do you think would help you to navigate this pandemic? And Daniela, you have a question? Oh, got your hand raised there. Yeah, Daniela, you want to ask something? All right. So what emotion would you like to feel more of? So joy, enthusiasm, hope, engagement.
Actually, I have a comment, a sort of advice related to navigating emotions. So I can, that is related to the philosophy of Stoicism. I think that we can sort of cheat on ourselves regarding to this insecurity. For example, if we plan our day productively and we obey our rules and complete the whole plan, we would be able later on when we want to reflect to say, oh, you know, during the coronavirus, I did this and that. So maybe in that way we can occupy our minds with something productive, important to ourselves. So just to, you know, escape from this whole thing.
Yeah,
To satisfy our needs.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, yeah. I think this kind of links to what I'm going to say now, actually. So there's, step one is just asking yourself every day, how would I like to feel today? And when you have that answer, so I'd like to feel more optimistic today, I'd like to feel, I'd like to feel joy, I'd like to feel calm, then what can I do to generate more of that emotion today? Of course, yeah, maybe we'd like to feel joy and optimism all the time, but we have to go to work. You know, it's not it's not so straightforward, but maybe you will decide, well, I'd like to feel at least 10% more optimistic today. So what's one thing I can do today to boost that optimism, right? And it might be, well, I'm going to go and look at positivenews.com. Or I'm going to look at a couple of nice videos of dogs for 10 minutes instead of looking at the news. And again, you might also like to feel informed about what's going on, but maybe you can ask yourself, is there a way I can know what's happening in the world without scrolling through news articles for an hour? Yeah. Can I ask a friend to give me the bullet points? Is there a podcast that summarizes it nicely? You know, can I limit myself to just 10 minutes of news, for example? Yeah, and remember, this isn't about suppressing the emotions and distracting yourself, right? Or numbing yourself. It's about calling more of the useful emotions into action. So again, as we did at the beginning, that could be stepping into your happy place. And the reason I made you all smile at the beginning is, you know, it can actually be that simple that when you smile, your brain starts to believe that you are happy and you start to actually feel better. So even when it sort of feels a bit weird at the beginning, if you just do these really simple things like smile or breathe deeply, you know, which calms you down and kicks in the parasympathetic nervous system, these little tricks can really help with managing it. I mean, I've got millions of things I can say about this, so I'm not going to go into a huge list now, but I think it's really important as well that we remember that emotions are largely physical. So we need to make sure our body has the energy it needs to manage emotions properly. So when we don't get enough sleep, when we're not eating well, or we're having too much caffeine, when we're not exercising, when we're not having enough natural light or spending enough time in nature, our body doesn't have what it needs to actually process our emotions. So, you know, it's all going to be a lot more out of whack anyway. And then getting involved in things larger than ourselves, as just one of many examples of things that can help us, you know, to feel a bit more optimistic. So I would love to stick around for 5 more minutes if you all can. Let me know if you've got to run away, but I just wanted to say, yeah, if you're interested in emotional intelligence training for yourself, for your organization, or whatever it is, I really recommend the training I did, so 6 seconds, and they have this Unlocking EQ, which is just a 2-day course, and you can do it online. Of course, it's all online now, but you can do it online or in person. And I think it's just £150 or something, but this is the first step if you want to train as a coach or educator, facilitator with emotional intelligence, or, you know, it's just really nice to do for yourself. So I'll send that link as well. And I have this offer for everyone who's here today, which is the 6 seconds emotional intelligence survey. It's called the SAY. It gives you these scores of how you are doing on all these emotional intelligence competencies. And doing this survey by itself isn't enough because it's a type B psychometric test. So it needs to come with a full debrief by a trained assessor, which I am. So normally it's, yeah, £120 for one of these 90-minute deep dives on emotional intelligence. But if you are interested to sign up, I'm going to send you a link as well to do this for £70. So that's like a 90-minute coaching session with this as a backbone. Although, you know, it's really useful if you want to just deep dive into anything really, whether it's, you know, just navigating the emotions of the pandemic, or it's something about a decision you're trying to make, a career-based thing, relationship-based thing, anything like that. So I'll send you the link as well if you book that by the end of the week. There's that offer on as well for everyone who joined today. So I would love to just give you a couple of minutes now to share any questions you've got or any thoughts you've got at the end of all that. And just jump in or raise your hand if you want to ask anything. Okay, so could I ask a couple of people to just share with me what is something that helps you to feel more optimistic or more joyful generally? Oh, Esther?
I do a lot of compassionate meditation, and that really helps for me.
Yeah. Do you do the loving kindness meditation, these kinds?
Yeah, it's really good to do. Really is very grounding, and yeah, fills you with just good feelings, makes you feel that you're able to take on the next step again.
Yeah, great, thank you. And Ali, you also had your hand up?
Yeah, I do. I have a coffee with the mums at the school gates. We go off, get a takeaway coffee and go in the park. And that's like getting a bit of reality back again. Because as a lone parent, you know, lockdown has been pretty hard. The only adult in the family, it's really hard with a 5-year-old. I think my vocabulary has gone back to being a 5-year-old again. But yeah, that's what I do. Connect with other people in the same position.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and that social connection is so important, right? And in terms of, from an emotional intelligence perspective, it's not natural for us to be alone and isolated, and to not have our tribe basically to share our feelings and problems with. So I think, making sure you're getting that social contact in one way or another is very important. Yeah, anyone else want to share? Maybe it's been a while since you've done it, so it will be a reminder for you of maybe here's something I can work into my life to help me feel a little bit more optimistic or joyful. Anyone else want to share one?
Actually, what you just said there about tribes,
Yeah.
I got thinking about Walkabout. So they send their braves out alone for the very first time, and that becomes their transition to manhood. Or, I would like to say womanhood as well. So in fact, maybe a lot of us are going to come out of lockdown stronger, because we've had effectively a transition like that, which is in the Western world, we don't have them. So this may be one for some people. We may come back a lot more angry, but positively angry and resilient. One way of thinking about
it's a
it.
rite of passage, right, for us. Yeah. I like to think so. Great. All right, well, thank you everyone so much for joining. I've recorded it, so if anyone missed it or wants to replay anything, I'll send the link out as well. All right, so thank you
Bye.
for joining.